So first bit today, I wanted to go through what's mostly Appendix B or Annex B in the new guidance. And it's around making robust DFG decisions in line with the legislation, the regulations, and the guidance. So basically, what can I give a grant for? Or can I give a grant for X? Can I give a grant for Y? Is one of the most common questions we get asked. And as always, it depends. It depends. There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer in every case, but there are 4 key elements when you're coming to make a robust decision about DFGs. So you need to know who the disabled occupant is, or that there is a disabled occupant. You need to know who the applicant is and they're eligible to apply. You need to know about the eligible works, and then you need to calculate the amount of grant. So if you've got those 4 things answered, and you could, I suppose, do them in any order, but typically you would follow that kind of progress through, then you could and probably you should approve a grant. But if you can't work out any of those, then you probably can't approve a grant. So I'm going to go through each of those step by step. So the first one is the disabled occupant. So there are 2 parts of the disabled occupant. So first is you have a disabled person. So that is somebody who's disabled if their sight, hearing, or speech is substantially impaired. They have a mental disorder or impairment of any kind, or as kind of in the case in the vast majority of grant applications, they are physically substantially disabled by illness, injury, or impairment. And the Act includes some specific references to Section 77 of the Care Act and to parts of the Children Act for children who are disabled. So that's kind of the legal aspect to it. And substantial, what does substantial mean? I think probably the best description comes from the Equalities Act, which talks about having a substantial effect on day-to-day activities, or one that's more than minor or trivial. So something that might be substantial includes taking long with everyday tasks like getting dressed, going to the toilet, or preparing meals because of pain, finding it difficult to talk to people and avoiding socialising. There's further examples within the Equalities Act. And it says the effects might only be minor or trivial if they have very little effect on daily life. And the other aspect, I suppose, of substantial is that it's long term. So something that has affected them is likely to affect them for at least a year, but their impairment will still be considered to be long term, even if the effects are likely to come and go. And also considered to be long term if it's for the rest of their life, even if that's going to be less than a year. So to approve a grant, you don't have to have a life expectancy of more than 12 months, for example. So as well as a disabled person, they have to be living somewhere in some accommodation. And the intention is that the disabled person will be living in a dwelling, which would be a house or a flat, caravan. So I suppose house on wheels is basically the description on that. Although there is a clause that says it can't include kind of railway rolling stock. So I don't know if anybody's approved anybody living in a railway carriage, but that's specifically excluded. But a qualifying houseboat can be included as accommodation, as long as it's designed or adapted as a place of permanent habitation and registered for council tax. So if you have a disabled person and you have accommodation and they're living in accommodation, then you have a disabled occupant, and you've ticked off the first of the 4 elements for eligibility for a DFG. So the second pillar of this eligibility is the applicant. And this is not necessarily the same person as the disabled occupant. In fact, quite a few situations, it won't be the same person. So it has to be somebody who has an owner's interest in the property. So that's either an owner-occupier or a landlord, or a tenant can apply, or the occupant of a caravan or qualifying houseboat, but not a railway carriage. And bodies that can't apply, or people can't apply, a local authority can't apply for a grant, or a CCG can't apply for a grant, or other such public bodies. A person from abroad can't apply for a grant, and in the new guidance there's a definition of what that means. And nobody under the age of 18 can apply for a grant. So in terms of owners, it's someone who owns or proposes to own the land, and it can be a solo application if more than one owner. So some of these that you could potentially approve a grant, but the person applying for it may then not have actual permission to carry out the works. But in terms of an owner's application, it can be a solo application. One of the key things is they have to intend that the disabled person will live there for 5 years or more from the date when the works are completed, unless, of course, their life expectancy isn't that long. And this includes leaseholders. Leaseholders are treated as owners if they have more than 5 years of their lease left, and owners can also include landlords. There's some specific requirements around landlords, which you can read about in the new guidance as well. So tenants include secure tenants and people who occupy a dwelling as part of their job. So if somebody lives in a flat over a shop, for example, they could be treated as a tenant. And this question comes up fairly regularly, but shared owners are actually tenants. They're basically a tenant who's paid a very big deposit for their home. But in terms of DFG, you would treat shared owners as tenants. Again, there has to be an intention that the disabled person will live there for 5 years or more from when the works are completed. And it should include an owner's certificate of the landlord, also saying that they intend for the disabled person to stay there for 5 years or more. And then your caravan and houseboat occupiers, again, there has to be the intention that they will stay there for 5 years or more. And there's also a consent certificate to be signed by the owners of the houseboat or mooring of the caravan, especially houseboat mooring, or the owners of the caravan or caravan park don't have to sign a consent certificate. So as long as you have either a tenant, an owner, or an occupant making the application, then you've got your applicant ticked off, and that's your second party eligibility sorted. So the next part is probably the bit that most people jump to first. And it's probably the most subjective. In fact, it is the most kind of subjective part of the assessment. The rest of it's fairly objective, but sometimes the eligible works can be a little bit more subjective. So what are eligible works? They're the adaptations that you can fund with a DFG, basically. And to understand or to assess what the eligible works for, there's a two-stage test. So firstly, do these adaptations that you want to do meet the purposes of DFG, which I will go through in a moment? And then, are they necessary and appropriate and reasonable and practicable to carry out? So do they meet the purposes is fairly objective, which I'll show you in a second. But the bit about necessary and appropriate in particular, I think is more of a subjective assessment. And it always depends on the individual circumstances. So quite often that's kind of the question, can we fit a safe room for this person under DFG? Can we fit an extra bath for this person under DFG? Can we replace the glass for this person under DFG? And it always depends. And to make a robust decision, you have to go through this two-stage test to give you a robust decision, particularly when you're saying no. I mean, if you're saying yes to a grant, then there's very little chance that anybody's going to object or challenge or criticise your decision. But if you're going to say no to somebody and refuse their application, then you have to really follow this quite carefully to make sure that you get to the right answer. Well, I suppose not even getting to the right answer, it's making sure that you've come to the right answer, you've come to the answer in the correct way. So across here are all of the purposes for which a DFG must be awarded. And that's what it says next. So if something meets a purpose, it must be awarded if you assess that it's necessary and appropriate and reasonable and practicable to carry out. So for example, if the proposed adaptation was a wash-dry toilet, which just appeared at the top of the slide, it would fit in to the purpose of access to a toilet. So that's the first stage of your decision. And then you would have to decide whether it was necessary and appropriate and reasonable and practicable to provide a grant for that wash-dry toilet. If you did, it goes into your tray of eligible works. For a shower, it fits into the purpose of access to a bath or shower. So that's a big tick for the first one. And then you assess whether it's necessary and appropriate and reasonable and practicable to carry that out. And if it does, it's added to your basket of eligible works. But if it's something else, maybe control of a light or something in the living room, again, it potentially would come under the, well, it would meet the purpose of control of heat, light and power. It's a fairly straightforward decision. But for some reason, you may decide it's not necessary and appropriate to do that. So it doesn't go into your basket of eligible works. So in this case, our basket of eligible works is the wash, dry, toilet and the shower. So in terms of necessary and appropriate, reasonable and practicable, the decision is always made by the housing authority or grants officer. Both parts of that are made. The decision is clearly made by the housing authority. That's what it sets out in the legislation. But they would take into account, or you would take into account if you're the grants officer, the assessment by an occupational therapist and or other specialists. So it doesn't have to be an OT. It could be other specialists, for example, with behaviours that challenge or other kind of cognitive impairments, that there may be other professionals you need to seek advice from, or maybe kind of a doctor. And if you work for a district council, you must consult the county council. If you're a unitary authority or a metropolitan borough, that requirement doesn't apply in the legislation, although it's still good practice to speak to your social services colleagues. But in any case, the decision is always finally made by the housing authority. In terms of that necessary and appropriate question, which is probably the main one in terms of the subjective element of the assessment, I've included within the new guidance the 9 guiding principles to consider when making that assessment. And these were something that was developed by Francis Hayward, who's a very well established and recognised OT, in a report, I think it was about 15 years ago. So these are the things that you should consider when you're assessing whether works are necessary and appropriate under the grant. So things like retaining or restoring dignity, having values recognised, element of choice, and particular needs for children, and considering the needs of the family members and of the family as a whole. Other things you might consider as part of that necessary and appropriate evaluation are religious and cultural beliefs of the household. Overcrowding is not a valid reason to refuse a grant in its own right. It may cause complications, and sometimes there's I suppose, kind of a mismatch about whether the adaptation is primarily for overcrowding or is primarily based on a disability or reason of disability. But overcrowding in itself isn't a reason to refuse a grant. Long-standing bit of the guidance is that strip washing is not an acceptable alternative to an appropriate bathroom. So if someone can only strip wash, then meeting the purpose of providing a bath or a shower hasn't been met. One of the new things in the guidance in terms of heating is that heating could also mean cooling. So for somebody with multiple sclerosis, for example, can be severely affected by heat during the summer. So if it's necessary and appropriate, then air conditioning could be grant funded. And you also kind of take into account the most cost-effective option when you're considering what's necessary and appropriate. So necessary and appropriate is by far the main bit of that question. The other half, well, it's not probably not, the other kind of 10% of it is probably reasonable and practicable. And this has been considerably reduced, particularly through there's a case from Islington a couple of years ago. So the Housing Authority would consider it's reasonable and practical to carry out the works having regard to the age and condition of the property. And the reason being is that it's probably not good use of resources to award a DFG to a house that's falling down. But that's pretty much the only aspect of reasonable and practicable that that still remains. There used to be reference to kind of fitness standards and things, but that was removed or repealed some time ago. So that was the 4 elements of the third of the 4 aspects of grant eligibility. And if there are any particular questions, Sinead, if you could pop those somewhere separately for me. I'd say there's been quite a lot of chat in the chat box. I'll pick those up in a moment. So the last one is amount of grant. So this is the 4th of the 4 pillars of DFG eligibility. And it's based on estimated expense, the means test, and the maximum amount. So the estimated expense is very simply the cost of the eligible work. So those things that we had in the basket at the bottom of the earlier slide. And you would usually get that from either the lower of 2 quotes or from a schedule of rates. You would add your service fees and charges to that. So if there's any agency fees to support the person through the process, you would add those on. And then the means test would potentially reduce that amount. The term actually contribution isn't mentioned anywhere in the legislation. It's the amount by which the grant is reduced. And I won't go into any detail on this here, but the means test is carried out on the relevant person, which is the disabled person, the disabled occupant and their partner. So it's not the applicant, if that's a different person or couple. It's the disabled occupant and their partner is the relevant person who is means tested. And the maximum amount is currently 30,000, which is there's going to be a consultation on later this year. So in terms of the amount of grant, you take the cost of works, you add the fees and charges, and that's your estimated expense. If your estimated expense is less than £30,000, then you knock off any contribution from that to get the amount of grant. If the estimated expense is over 30,000, then it's £30,000 less your contribution, gives your amount of grant. And those are your 4 key elements of a DFG application or kind of eligibility for a DFG application. And for any grant that you're going to approve, you need to have ticked off all 4 of those elements to be able to approve it, which you would do usually as you're going through the process. But I think another one thing that we see quite a lot in local authority areas, or areas in districts and boroughs and counties that we visit, is there's quite often a panel meeting that looks just at the necessary and appropriate element for of kind of an assessment. And I think there's kind of 2 key things around that I think are wrong. So firstly is that necessary and appropriate is only one part of your eligible works assessment, and it doesn't include the other 3 pillars of making a DFG application or DFG approval. So having a meeting that focuses just on one subsection of the eligibility question. Seems a little bit odd. And the other bit, that kind of the guidance I've put on this slide here, comes directly from the Statutory Care Act guidance, which I think probably talks mostly about panel meetings and resource allocation meetings that happen in social care anyway. But it's kind of reflecting that panels may be an appropriate government mechanism to sign off large or unique schemes. So, you know, you might have panel meetings if you've got large extensions that are funded from a mixture of DFG, discretionary DFG, social care funding, community healthcare funding. You might get a group of people together to discuss those. But what you shouldn't have are panel meetings that look at every single assessment or application, that look at every shower, every stair lift, every ramp, and are micromanaging this process, or purely there to manage the budget. That should be done, delegated down to the grants officer, because that, at the end of the day, that's their job. And panel meetings should not be in place for every single assessment or application that goes through. And if you do have them, please take a copy of this video, put it on the agenda for your next panel meeting, and question why on earth you are spending all these hours preparing papers and going through this process of panel meetings when you could be out doing more assessments, because it has no place whatsoever in the DFG process. And if you want to invite me along to any panel meetings to say that, I'm very happy to do so. And maybe some of our regional advisors will come along and say that as well. But please do take the opportunity to kind of review and revise that if you can. Because as you probably saw in the Channel 4 News piece a few weeks ago, there are delays for assessment across large areas of the country. And if we can remove DFG allocation panels, then that should take at least a couple of weeks out of the process in many, many cases. So that was my run through, I think, kind of the 4 key elements of a DFG decision.